Let's say you're the new HR manager at a factory. A worker's just announced she's quitting. After years of working in the same position, she developed a repetitive stress injury. She'd asked her supervisor several times to be transferred to another position. He said he'd look into it and then never followed up. Finally, she applied to work in another factory just so she could move to a different line position. It's a shame to lose an experienced worker for reasons that could be so easily prevented. What could help you prevent losses like this in the future? Our surveys of factory workers have found that workers are more likely to leave factories where there's poor communication. And multiple studies show that worker strikes and unrest are often related to a lack of communication between workers and management. A worker management communication system provides channels between workers and managers to help all employees express their concerns and ideas. One of the key components of a worker management communication system is a worker feedback system. A worker feedback system is made up of channels for accepting worker feedback, procedures for recording and passing on worker feedback, documentation to ensure worker feedback is retained and analyzed, and implementation processes to respond to feedback. Let's start with the different channels your factory has in place for receiving feedback. When you talk to the supervisor, he says he was busy managing less experienced workers, and he felt that the worker's request could wait. Besides, she could have just talked to the production manager. So why didn't she? If a worker's first choice for feedback isn't effective or appropriate to the issue, they need to know there are other channels available and they're allowed to use them. There's no one perfect solution for encouraging and handling worker suggestions, complaints, and grievances. Factories should have several different channels to receive and respond to worker feedback. Most of the time, workers will speak to their supervisor if they have complaints. We found that 75% of feedback goes through supervisors. Supervisors are aware of the day-to-day experience of their workers, and in many situations, they can resolve the problem quickly. So supervisors should be extensively trained on how to effectively receive and manage feedback. But workers will avoid talking to supervisors if they have direct complaints about their supervisor, so there should be other people workers can talk to. An open-door policy allows workers to go directly to HR personnel or even the general manager with any concerns. Workers probably won't use this channel very often, but it sends a message that the company is committed to hearing what workers have to say. Every factory should also have a worker representative channel through a worker committee or union. Some workers will be more comfortable talking to a worker representative who can bring concerns to management on workers' behalf. Nearly every factory has a suggestion box. Suggestion boxes should be easily accessible and provide privacy to the worker who's submitting feedback. It's good practice to put these boxes in a bunch of places, like the factory floor, canteens, and more private areas like bathrooms. And make sure they're checked regularly. In more and more countries, a majority of workers have mobile phones. Lots of factories now offer hotlines for workers through phone calls, SMS, or messaging apps. Workers often feel more comfortable giving feedback through their phones, allowing them to leave anonymous messages or attach their names. For managers, it also allows you to track and categorize feedback based on keywords so you can analyze feedback more effectively. Make sure that workers know about the channels available to them by informing them during orientation and publishing information on posters or bulletin boards. All channels should adhere to confidentiality rules. This means only authorized personnel see the feedback. Also, management must provide at least one channel that allows for anonymous feedback. Now that we've explored feedback channels, let's learn procedures for handling feedback. These procedures depend on the type of feedback. This can be categorized into three areas: suggestions, complaints, or grievances. Which of the feedback shown here would you classify as suggestions? Suggestions are worker comments on how to improve factory operations or conditions, such as production processes, management rules, working conditions, dormitories, or food. Complaints are worker concerns about a situation they think is unfair, but not situations where management has violated a law or company policy. Grievances, on the other hand, are complaints that refer to instances which violate the law or company policy. For example, violations of factory rules, employment contracts, codes of conduct, or collective bargaining agreements. Which of the following is a complaint but not a grievance? The worker may feel it's unfair to have a job that's so tiring, but it's not illegal or against company policy, so it doesn't qualify as a grievance. It's important to understand the difference between suggestions, complaints, and grievances because each may require a different procedure to respond. There are 4 steps. First, record the feedback from the worker. Then, report the feedback to the designated staff member. At regular intervals, the feedback should be reviewed by management, and then management will decide how to respond. Recording and reporting feedback should be handled by the person receiving the feedback, such as the supervisor. They need to be trained on feedback procedures to ensure that worker feedback is properly classified and handled. Each factory HR department can decide how to report worker feedback, whether it's in weekly meetings or in a database. After supervisors have recorded and reported worker feedback, managers can then review and respond to the feedback. In your factory, you've now established a worker feedback system. You monitor all feedback submitted during the first few months. You note that there are very few complaints and grievances submitted by workers. It could mean that workers must be feeling much better about management. What do you think? The goal of an effective worker feedback system is not to reduce complaints or grievances, but to reduce repetitive complaints and grievances, and to encourage helpful suggestions. In this situation, we need to understand why management was receiving less feedback. This starts with documenting worker feedback. Be sure to record issue reported, type of issue, who followed up, and what was the result. By documenting what happened, you'll be able to analyze the effectiveness of the way that you're handling feedback later on. You'll be able to track the percentages of suggestions, complaints, and grievances, issues resolved, and workers who've brought feedback. You should review the nature of the data to ensure repetitive complaints are decreasing. Check that staff respond to feedback in a fair and consistent manner, according to company procedures. On a regular basis, survey or interview workers to review how their cases were handled and the level of satisfaction with your feedback channels. The last component of the worker feedback system is implementation. Let's see how this is working in your factory. Last month, a few workers fainted at their workstations, and the rumor was that chemicals used in production were toxic. Supervisors just told workers that the chemicals were safe, and nobody wanted to complain to upper management for fear that they'd be labeled troublemakers. There was also an anonymous hotline, but many didn't think that the hotline was truly anonymous. They wondered if there was a way to track and fire workers who complained. What's the real problem here? No matter the channel, workers will not submit feedback unless they believe the system works and can be trusted. Management needs to demonstrate over time that if workers submit feedback, the right person will receive and address their concerns. Anyone who submits a grievance, complaint, or suggestion must not be reprimanded or retaliated against. Top management must enforce a strong anti-retaliation policy, including serious consequences for anyone who mistreats or intimidates a worker for speaking out. If the suggestion, complaint, or grievance involves 2 parties, the response procedures should ensure that both parties are treated equally. The person in charge of making decisions should not be personally involved in the issue and should make decisions based on objective evidence. Finally, one worker called the hotline to report her concerns. The man who answered took down her report and assured her that he would send an email to HR. The worker felt relieved and glad she made the call. but her relief turned to disappointment when, after a few weeks, no changes were made and workers continued to get sick. She called again. This time a woman answered and told her she would email the health and safety director. What do you think was the main problem with the way feedback was managed? In fact, management did investigate the issue and found that the chemicals were safe. It turned out that workers were falling ill due to a severe flu virus. But because many workers were not informed of the outcome, they lost trust in the system. The process by which suggestions, complaints, and grievances are reviewed and decided upon should be understood by all employees. If workers have questions about the decision, they should receive a formal explanation of the rationale behind the decision and their rights to appeal. Let's do a quick review before the final quiz. A worker management communication system provides channels between workers and managers to help all employees express their concerns and ideas. One of the key components of a worker management communication system is a worker feedback system. A worker feedback system is made up of channels for accepting worker feedback, procedures for recording and passing on worker feedback, documentation to ensure worker feedback is retained and analyzed, and implementation processes to respond to feedback. Factories should offer workers several feedback channels. These could include supervisors, the most common channel, open door policy to HR or upper management, worker representatives such as work committee members, suggestion boxes, and electronic channels such as hotline or messaging apps. Make sure that all feedback to all channels is kept confidential and that workers have an anonymous feedback channel. There should be different procedures depending on the type of worker feedback. Feedback can be suggestions, complaints, or grievances. A grievance is a complaint that also violates the law or customer codes of conduct. Procedures should detail systematic processes for recording, reporting, reviewing, and responding to worker feedback. Supervisors and managers should be trained to carry out these procedures. All worker feedback and management's responses should be documented. Be sure to record issue reported, type of issue, who followed up, and what was the result. Then analyze your data to track the percentages of suggestions, complaints, and grievances, issues resolved, and workers who have brought feedback. Monitor the effectiveness of your process by assessing whether repetitive complaints are reducing over time. Identify the correct method of documenting worker feedback. The goal of an effective worker feedback management system is not to reduce complaints or grievances, but to reduce repetitive complaints or grievances, and to encourage helpful suggestions. Workers will not submit feedback unless they believe the system works and can be trusted. Management needs to follow all steps in procedures, documentation, and implementation to demonstrate that worker concerns will be addressed in a fair, consistent, and timely way. Employees should understand the process by which suggestions, complaints, and grievances are reviewed and decided upon. Proper implementation will help make a better work atmosphere and more fluid communication between workers and management. Thank you for taking the time to complete this lesson.